Moscow claims the Russian capital was attacked by Ukrainian drones this week, while Ukraine continues to be hit by drone attacks in Kyiv and Odessa. Has the war focus shifted towards attacking civilian infrastructure, and what could the impact be of these attacks?
It's obviously been reported that Ukraine has launched attacks against Moscow, that the drones got through, but that they were taken down by Russian air defense. And if you look at what's been happening in the preceding weeks, you could see that there's potentially a tit for tat going on, because you've had in turn attacks on the Kerch Bridge, which is the Crimean bridge linking Crimea with Russia, by Ukraine. That's arguably led on to a sustained attack on Odessa. So this is the Black Sea sort of ports, where Russia's been attacking a number of sort of infrastructure areas, grain facilities. And then you've had this attack of drones then on Moscow. And you could link them all together. You could say it's a symptom of the fact that obviously the fighting on the ground is quite fixed at the moment. There's not a lot of movement going on. There's not a lot of drastic change. So everything's happening sort of that way with missiles and drones. I suppose what's interesting about the drone attack on Moscow is, whilst it didn't physically cause any damage or reportedly any loss of life or any injury, it's demonstrated yet again that Ukraine has the ability to reach right into the heart of Russia and hit it, at its heart, its political capital, Moscow, which it did previously, I think in May, when there was an attack on the Kremlin. And so Russia seems sort of unable to stop these relatively sort of cheap drones getting through. And whilst they might not be having any material effect, psychologically and politically, that has quite a lot of effect, because Ukraine is able to demonstrate that despite Russians' power and might, it can still breach its defences.
Ukraine denies attacking Moscow, and there's been some speculation the attacks may have come from inside Russia.
And it was suggested, I think, by the US military on the last attack against the Kremlin that actually maybe the drones were launched from within Russia by pro-Ukrainian forces, sort of saboteurs, terrorists, if you like. And that's, again, another sort of, I guess, worrying development for the Russians, because obviously that means that they're not only fighting a war sort of externally against Ukraine, but they've got problems domestically. And obviously, this is all adding up with the Wagner kind of sort of uprising earlier on that was reported, and albeit sort of thwarted, we're still obviously unclear about what cost to Putin and what deals had to be done to sort of diffuse that situation. So he's facing sort of attacks on a number of fronts now, and if there are forces inside Russia that are launching drones, that's yet another issue he's got to deal with.
Russia continues to attack Ukraine's ports, with the impact felt not just in Ukraine, but also the rest of the world.
And we saw way back, one of the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine being that this has affected world food prices because of the suppression and the inability for the Ukrainians to export what it produces in huge quantities for the rest of the world. That suddenly taken out of the food supply chains has had a big consequential effect on global food supply chains. So there's a knock-on effect there. More recently, you've had this Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was a deal with Russia to help keep grain supplies going despite the ongoing conflict. And Russia's recently pulled out of that, probably in retaliation to some of the advances that Ukraine is making. So that's just made the ability for Ukraine and the world to access invaluable grain supplies much harder. And then now you've got Russia attacking port infrastructure in Odessa and a number of other ports along the Black Sea coast. These are all going to have an impact on a global impact on food security. So the availability of food is going to become harder, but also what we see is pushing up of food prices. And typically this tends to disproportionately affect poorer countries, developing countries, where they're less resilient to sort of shocks to the food supply, global food supply. They have less reserves, they have less money or ability to access other areas. So this will be felt globally, both in terms of prices and availability.
What does Russia hope to achieve by targeting Ukraine's infrastructure?
This is all, I guess, sort of partly psychological against the Ukrainian population to try and reduce morale, maybe try and get them to sort of decide or remove their kind of will to fight, if you like, and in turn that might put pressure on the Ukrainian government and Zelensky to sort of broker a deal, perhaps. But what you often find with these sorts of things, we've seen it throughout history, attacks on the civilian population often has the opposite effect, and it galvanizes the population around a common cause against a common enemy. More recent attacks on power infrastructure will have a less effect in the short term, because obviously we're still in sort of summer where there's less requirement to have, I guess, access to energy, access to heating. You could obviously look at the attack recently on the dam, which has had a big impact both on people and on the environment, because that's flooded a number of settlements, both in Ukraine, but also Russian-occupied Ukraine. And it's also damaged the environment. So you've got damage to fish stocks, you've got a removal of significant water supplies, and also it's rendered large amounts of agricultural land unusable. So many senses, the destruction of the dam, which most believe was done by Russian military forces, could have a much longer lasting consequence upon all populations in that area.
As both sides continue to make slow progress on the front lines, we could see more drone attacks on key infrastructure in the coming weeks. Simon Banks, The Sun.